Thank you, everyone, for joining us today to consider the issue of strangulation, as in strangulation that does not result in death. Now, I appreciate that's not a soft opening to a presentation, but there is no chit-chat or levity that I can bring to this subject. Strangulation, which was not intended to and does not result in death, and is often, we know, used as a means of coercion, control, intimidation, forced submission, now referred to as non-fatal strangulation. And we're here today because of the significance and incidents highlighted by global research and campaign to tackle it pushed by Foyle Women's Aid. There's no sugarcoating or window dressing with this, I'm afraid. I remember Mary Brown, when she came back from the strangulation centres, the Hope Alliance in the US. She had lots of experts' materials under her arm. And I know, although she was far too polite to say, she hadn't seen or heard anything she hadn't witnessed herself over the years in her work. And I suspected then and know now that it was too familiar from some of the work she had done. But she brought back a huge energy and appetite to apply the practice she had learned there. So she knew about the issue, but she learned something about the practice. And she has kept us all going ever since. As has been said, non-fatal strangulation is now a criminal offence in its own right, but only as of 26th of June 2023. And based on what I'm about to say, you may find that peculiar. Before I do get into that, and I will discuss the prevalence of non-fatal strangulation and what we can do to tackle it, but I do think it's essential to frame what I'm going to say both as a matter of fact and of legal standards. It is a fact that the horror of being utterly controlled within an inch of life by another person applying pressure to one's neck has been known by many for many years, forever probably. It is a fact that the incidence of non-fatal strangulation is primarily part of a pattern in intimate partner violence and abuse. It is a fact that almost all victims are women and almost all perpetrators are men. It is a legal requirement that the state and its agencies take steps to protect individuals from harm, including the harm caused by non-fatal strangulation. And it's critical this is seen as a human rights issue. Human rights law, incorporated by the Human Rights Act, provides a scheme with the signal purpose to guarantee fundamental rights that are universal. And that means they're given to each and every human being equally. They're indivisible. And that means that all rights need to be enjoyed. If one is undermined, so are all. And inalienable. And that means they can't be taken off anyone. Non-fatal strangulation, it's hard to imagine any greater human rights breach or indignity to a human being. It's hard to imagine a person who is subject to it and a victim of it enjoying any other rights in any meaningful way. Properly considered and applied, the Human Rights Act could and should already have led to better protection against strangulation. They are the framework of mandatory standards that inform everything: legislation, policy, training, appliance, application of practice. So don't let yourselves off the hook if you think it's only been a law recently. There has always been an obligation, it seems to me, to do something, but we at least now have a standalone offence. Human rights range from, and this is why it's so important to see this as a human rights issue. Human rights range from the most fundamental, such as the right to life itself, but also, equally importantly, all of those that make life worth living. And that includes things like health, liberty, association, and family. And as I say, a victim of something as terrifying and invasive as this is not going to enjoy any of those rights. I won't go through the range of law that is relevant and has been relevant even in advance of this criminal offence, but they are in the report if you want to go back to them. But essentially, in summary, it means the state and its agencies must identify the harm that its people might be exposed to. So you can't sit and wait for somebody to tell you that there's a harm out there. You need to go and find out what your people are at risk of. They must identify victims, those who are likely to be victims, and recognise the full harm they're caused, not just some of it. Thereafter, they must take steps Whatever is reasonable, so we're not saying that it has to be at all costs, but whatever is reasonable, and reasonable bearing in mind that this is an affront to human rights. They must educate themselves and enact measures to protect all of those victims from all of that harm. Now, just to, again, and Gail has set this quite clearly, but I think it does bear repetition, what we're talking about here. So if we talk, and it's easy to just think of this as almost a game as to what words we use, but words are really important. Common methods of strangulation, they are manual pressure around the neck, a chokehold or headlock, pressure applied by an arm, for example, a foot or knee on the neck, a ligature like a belt or scarf tightened around the neck and hanging. Strangulation, fatal and otherwise, is much repeated form of violence. As I say, engages a number of fundamental human rights. Not only does it engage those rights, it violates them in a grotesque way and demeans society as a whole. The fact we're only getting this standalone law now suggests to me the issue is greater and deeper than just law and extends into societal attitudes reflected in other studies of domestic violence and abuse. We need to have a bigger conversation. None of us can or should take pride in any commitment we have to society or to public health and well-being while this continues unaddressed, and it's continuing in families, in schools, workplaces and healthcare settings. This law is therefore the bare minimum, a criminal law against non-fatal strangulation. We have so much more to do. We have now reached, however, the stage of understanding and evidence, which is why just even having this said in a report is important. We've reached the stage that further inaction will be an obvious failure by the state to discharge its obligations to protect the human rights of its people. This report was intended to get a handle on what is happening and offer some assistance in tackling it, but as much as that, it was to just put down in black and white that this happens here. It deals only with strangulation within intimate relationships, and that's not to diminish the horror of strangulation elsewhere, but it's to recognise that most of it happens in those sorts of relationships. It recognises that non-fatal strangulation happens as part of domestic violence and abuse. And while I say there were obligations previously, in the absence of a standalone offence, it proved difficult, if not impossible, to track the incidence of non-fatal strangulation in Northern Ireland because the vast majority of it is within what we otherwise define as domestic violence and abuse. But because of that, we can make a well-informed estimates. It has, and unfortunately, the incidence of domestic violence and abuse has continued to be horrifically high, including particularly, actually, in Northern Ireland. That almost certainly means prevalence of non-fatal strangulation is also horrifically high in Northern Ireland, and I do justify that in the report. Yet, prior to 2023, you would have struggled to find any real evidence of it in official statistics or records. Even the police didn't record it specifically or properly. There were no prosecutions for it, not for it that merited its standing. Couldn't be tracked, no sentencing remarks really that could be relied upon. If it was taken into account, it was often buried in the midst of all the other information on a case. And even where it was directly relevant to a case, in a civil or criminal case, it rarely was brought into it, and you certainly don't tend to see it popping up then in the judgment, although the Lady Chief Justice did refer to the factual scenarios in which it was often present in cases. We know that it was often too awkward to prove, and it could expose victims in many cases. Those are failings of the criminal justice system and of my profession. It was also a failure of police and prosecutors at the time. They didn't probe the issue with a victim who reported. Lawyers didn't ask, and rarely did prosecutors pursue it as an aggravating feature. So we didn't actively go out and try and address it. In courtrooms across the UK and beyond, lawyers have challenged victims' evidence with the following: do you expect this court to believe you were assaulted when there isn't a mark on you? And it's such an obvious point to make. A barrister might almost be negligent if he or she didn't make it And I'm ashamed to say at a very early point in my career, I might actually have, I recall saying something very similar. You can only make points like that. And this practice should only continue if you deliberately disengage from the issue about strangulation, and only if you don't take time to learn about what it really is. The amount of pressure that is applied can vary, but in each case, it is a form of violence. Don't be fooled that it's not violence if it doesn't leave an obvious mark. So no one can say now they haven't been warned. That's the beauty of having this standalone offence. It can be recorded, charged, and prosecuted. We can see what's happening. Victims should be reassured, which in turn will lead to greater numbers reporting and so on. We'll be able to measure prevalence much more accurately, but also we'll be able to look at whether or not all these new measures have worked. There's no point spending time, resources, and effort if you don't monitor whether it's actually doing what you set out to do. And I think we do need to do an awful lot more in relation to data collection and monitoring. So to get back to this point, often heard in court proceedings, you haven't a mark on you. We do know that strangulation is physically harmful in ways that aren't immediately apparent, and in some cases may never become apparent to the naked eye, but it has caused harm. So not only must lawyers abandon that cheap cross-examination trick, police and medics must inquire and thereafter screen. Even if that particular victim is now safe and out of harm's way, we know, and Gail has repeated this, that someone who strangles tends to go on to do it again and again, and that their violence tends to escalate. We need to identify these people to protect the next potential victim. We also already know the great psychological injury that is caused. With any form of abuse and violence, the non-physical scars can last a long time and affect not only the enjoyment of life, but life itself. A victim of strangulation is rendered powerless, confused, demeaned, terrified. And you're going to hear from women today far better than I can possibly express it, but women who've experienced this. And when listening to their stories, which is incredibly courageous to share with us, don't just feel sorry for them. Don't just feel sorry that it happened to them. Try to imagine what it must feel like to repeatedly face down the prospect of your own death, to be taken to the edge of your own murder, because that's what we're talking about here. To have your life in the hands of the person you love or did love, and who should care for you or maybe even did once upon a time. Strangulation is often favoured by perpetrators of domestic violence and abuse because it is a powerful demonstration of their power and control. They know the effect it has on the victim. It's power and control that says, I could kill you very easily. If not this time, then another time. The more you resist, the more likely that is. And if you leave, I'll follow you and do it then. I said earlier that most victims are women and most perpetrators men. Now, I know I can't just leave that hanging, and that requires some justification. So let me deal with it up front. Because we know that it is overwhelmingly perpetrated on women by men who they are in or were in a relationship with, the figures in relation to non-fatal strangulation within intimate partner relationship, I'm stumbling over my own words, intimate partner relationships, where research proves unquestionably. And since I completed this research, there's been a more recent report which I would draw your attention to. It's published by the Institute for Addressing Strangulation. It's as recent as September 2023. It's England and Wales, but there's no reason to believe that we're going to be different. In fact, we're probably worse, which I will come on to. But it looked at strangulation homicides, and it found that where a suspect was identified, and we know that not always suspects are identified, but when they were, 94% of those cases, they were male suspects. If one looks at that within a domestic setting, in all cases of strangulation homicide between 2011 and 2021, all victims were female. We must call this what it is. It's a very gendered form of violence, a form of violence by men on women. Now, that's not to demonise men. To recognise the gendered nature of this violence is not to ignore the rights of male victims. It is simply being honest about what the issue is in an attempt to make meaningful interventions. A human rights approach means you look at the human being in front of you. If they need more, they get more. This is what human rights compliance is about, and that is what true equality is about. If a person has a specific need, you cater for it. In the context of this issue, women have a specific need that is so clear that not to make special provision for women would be discriminatory, and that's also in the allocation of resources. Another finding from a September 23 report that's worth noting is the following, and I think this maybe explains a little bit about why it's taken us so long. And I quote, "In the intimate partner violence homicides in which women are killed by men, the circumstances are most frequently labelled as quarrel, revenge, or loss of temper." Now, the studies went on. This is problematic. A loss of temper and revenge imply a trigger event, while quarrel suggests two or more people arguing. More insightful categorisation of these homicides would include explicit references to domestic violence, coercive control, and misogyny. So how about Northern Ireland? Because most of the work has been done elsewhere. How prevalent is it actually here? My unsatisfactory answer for you is we don't really know yet, not empirically, but we can make a very reliable inference. By analysing the domestic violence statistics, we can get a real sense of it. As I say, Northern Ireland is unlikely to be very different from the rest of the world, but if it is different, sadly, it's likely that it will have a higher prevalence because of the decades-long conflict. And I deal with some of that in the report, and there's lots of evidence to substantiate that, including by Alyson Swain, who's done some terrific work in this area. But what is beyond question is that domestic violence and abuse is a serious endemic problem in Northern Ireland. It has been for a long time. It doesn't appear to be abating, albeit I do acknowledge the police are much better at dealing with it and have made significant efforts, and hopefully you'll hear some of those from Superintendent McNally. But I want to take you very briefly back to 2007-2008, during a thematic review I carried out for the Policing Board. Because in 2007-2008, it was actually 2009 I was reporting, I recorded 25 murders, of which 11 had a domestic motivation. In other words, 44% of all murders during that period had a domestic motivation. And as we know, that means almost exclusively murders of women. In 2007-2008, more than 2/3 of all crimes with a domestic motivation were categorised as violent crime. So we also know this is not criminal damage, etc. This is violence against the person. We knew then that victims did not tend to report until they'd suffered 30-odd incidents. We also, incidentally, now know that in terms of non-fatal strangulation, even less likely to report. There were more recorded crimes in Northern Ireland with a domestic motivation than the combined total of sexual offences, robbery, armed robbery, hijacking, theft, or unauthorised taking of motor vehicles, arson, dangerous driving, handling stolen goods, and offences under anti-terrorism legislation. I will hear whether that's still the pattern. But can you imagine if all of those offences received as little attention and resources as domestic violence and abuse? It was estimated that the total cost of domestic abuse in Northern Ireland could amount to approximately £180 million per year. Research shows then and now that even when it is reported, it tends to be underreported. And this is where I think strangulation has been this is where the language as well as having the standalone offence really matters. We need to be able to talk about it. We need to say it out loud, say those words out loud. And people who are victim of this need to know that they can say it out loud and they're not going to be judged, and we will all see it for what it is. We also have within that some groups even less likely to report than others. Muslim women is one obvious example. They tend to be much slower to report violence by a male within the family. Give you an updated picture for Northern Ireland. I wish I could say it's got better since I looked at it in 2007-2008, but let me tell you what the police say. 2017-2018, the highest level of domestic abuse incidents and crimes since 2004-05, and that was when the data set was first collected, so we don't know whether it extended beyond that, but I suspect it did. In the same year, there were 23 murders in Northern Ireland, of which 11 occurred in a domestic context. 11 people lost their lives in the context of domestic violence and abuse. Can you imagine if that was a death in other circumstances? The country would be brought to a standstill, I dare say, until it was remedied. PSNI recorded that between 2008 and 2021, intentional homicide of women by intimate partners increased fourfold. Of 36 police services across the UK, the PSNI recorded the 8th highest rate of femicide per 100,000 of the population. Women's Aid tell us and have reported that non-fatal strangulation and asphyxiation are a common feature of domestic abuse cases they deal with, so we can start to build up a picture of just how common this is. And I don't want to be, I wish I could find some note of optimism. I'm afraid I can't really. In the 12 months from 1st of April 22 to 31st of March 23, there were 32,875 domestic abuse incidents, of which 22,343 were designated as crimes. This is not, on any estimation, minor stuff. That represented 17 domestic abuse incidents and 12 domestic abuse crimes per 1,000 of the population. That's staggering when you really start to think about it. 8 of the policing districts showed an increase in the number of domestic abuse crimes. And it's like going back, building on this picture, that almost certainly means I need an increase in non-fatal strangulation. There are 8 homicides of women recorded with a domestic abuse motivation during that time. Within a month of this new offence, 49 people arrested and 26 charged. Clearly, there's an issue. It's a significant one. It's as great here, if not greater, than elsewhere. So we've got this law. Surely that's it, sorted. And it's tempting to think maybe that's right. And certainly the law came into, well, we became aware the law was going to be brought into force when I was doing this. And it would have been tempting just to down tools and say, well, that's now sorted. But I'm afraid it's far from it. The standalone offence is a critical but minor piece of the puzzle. And that's why I've spent so much time on the context of domestic violence and abuse, because you can't look at this without understanding the other. Real progress will only follow from a multi-agency approach in which each and every stakeholder is committed to the eradication of domestic violence and abuse, which includes non-fatal strangulation. We know they've got to develop, and I know they're working really hard on effective procedures to reach and respond to all victims, wherever they may be within Northern Ireland and from whatever community or background. But what is likely to make the most significant and long-lasting change is a change to societal norms through awareness raising, education, training and enforcement. That's where we need to really start. The law is terrific and it can be used with great effect, but it's not going to plug the gap. Mindset of individuals and organisations need to change, and that is when we will see the real difference. And that's why it's been partly why it's been such a pleasure to be involved with the Family Justice Centre. This is a real working example, a practical example of what we've all been waiting for. We keep talking about multi-agency approaches, but we've never really managed to achieve them. This is the way to do it, and other people have done it for us. I have the pleasure of sitting on the board, but really Mary and her colleagues are the ones who set this up. We have no excuse for not talking to each other and getting together and really starting to tackle this. Also critical is public awareness raising, as I've said, and professional training. Now, the reason public awareness raising is so vital is that the public need to be aware of it, to identify it amongst their friends, family members, colleagues. And victims need to be able to identify it, and they need to know that it's not acceptable. They don't need to tolerate it, and it's not really what this report went into, but it's not a trivial form of sexual expression. They need to be encouraged to report, as with other domestic violence, and those who offer services to the public need to be able to identify victims or people at risk. And this is, again, where the Justice Centre, I think, and Foyle Women's Aid have done such a terrific job, identifying all those key people. So GPs, dentists, hairdressers, they're all likely to deal with victims even though they don't know it, but they are in a position to notice the effects. Remember, a victim's only going to report if given with this particularly horrendous form of offending that it is the edge of homicide. if convinced they'll be taken seriously and protected. We cannot ask anybody to report in those sort of circumstances unless we can deliver for them. So before applying pressure to women to report, it's easy to say you need to come forward, you need to stick with the prosecution, etc. Before we ask them to do that, let's sort out the support services for those women. Let's have all that in place. It must include as bare minimum appropriate forensic and medical services, but cannot end there. It's all the other stuff. We also know, and it's gratifying that somebody here from with the housing background, we know victims don't report because they've nowhere to go, many. But if they remain, they will be at greater risk. But it's a risk they take, and it's a risk they take often to protect children, and because they think the greatest risk is to find somewhere else on the street. So the services must include suitable accommodation, social welfare report, access to education for their children, financial support and free, reliable legal advice. None of that is sufficient as things stand. So to summarise and conclude, gender-based violence has occurred within society, regardless of age, race, national origin and class, for as long as we know. It's profound, it's insidious, and it is a form of discrimination against women and a fundamental breach of human rights. It's a problem which must be tackled by all of us, by all members of society, and each and every statutory and voluntary agency. So we really have, if there's anything at all that's come out of this work, it's that we all need to get together. We can't leave women to do this or look after themselves and protect themselves. We must do it for them and make sure that there is enough around them that when they're able to come forward, they do. As I say, the Family Justice Centre has made it easy. You have all the tools now with this last piece of the puzzle, the law. There are victims' lives depending on it today. There may even be people in this room who are still victims of this, and that's just not good enough. So I'm going to leave it there. As I say, we are going to hear from the experts. Sadly, the experts are those with experience of this. But don't just listen to it as a hard luck story. Listen to it and think of yourselves in their position and wonder how on earth they have the strength and the courage to stand here and talk to you about it. And can I finish by thanking Tom Burgess and Mary Brown. Tom has lent a huge amount of experience, and he is being very modest about himself while talking about all the rest of us. But really, without somebody of his calibre leading this, it is very difficult to get across the line, particularly with a lot of statutory agencies. So I would like to thank him as well, because he won't thank himself, I'm sure. Thank you.